My name is Blaise Simke. I'm President and CEO of Sage Publications, and we are here today to celebrate our 50th anniversary, which we have done in other cities, but we're doing it in Washington for a very specific reason. I would like to start, though, by congratulating Sarah Miller McCune again for bringing Sage through 50 years, and for the commitment. Yeah. Very few corporations survive 50 years, and I think we have Sarah and her late husband, George McCune, to thank for their vision and their commitment to Sage. We're celebrating in Washington because this is the city where policy is made, and we do believe at Sage that policy and social science research are connected. Our political representatives come to Washington, and everything that they do, every issue that they address, every speech that they give, the legislation that they draft, in one way or another, is connected to social science research. I think, ironically, even our political representatives who disagree with funding for social science research often use social science data when they're making that argument. So today, we put together a program to kick off our celebrations here in Washington, D.C. We put together a program really to celebrate social science research and to talk about the impact that Sage has had over the last 50 years with a program called Stories of Research to Reality, How the Social Sciences Changed the World. And we do believe that very passionately at Sage. We do believe that good research leads to good policy, which does change the world. And so I'd like to introduce our host for the day, John Sides, who's a professor of political science right here at George Washington University. He's the co-author of two books, The Gamble, Choice and Chance in the 2012 Presidential Election, and then the second book, Campaigns and Elections, Rules, Reality, Strategy, and Choice. And he is also the founder and a continuing contributor to The Monkey Cage, a blog that is now part of the Washington Post. So please join me in welcoming John Sides.
Thank you, Blaise, and it's a real pleasure to be here and to honor the work that Sage has done on its 50th anniversary. We're very grateful here in Washington for their advocacy and for their leadership on all of these issues that pertain to the health and the vitality of social science. Last week, if you were here in Washington, just a couple of blocks away, people were camping out beside the Supreme Court before the oral arguments in the case Obergefell v. Hodges, which is the case the court is considering about same-sex marriage. And in those oral arguments, the justices, several of them, expressed concern about what the implication of their decision might be for public opinion, and in particular, would there be a backlash among the public if the court was to issue a relatively expansive endorsement of a constitutional right for marriage among same-sex couples. The next day, an article appeared in the American Journal of Political Science website. I hesitate to mention the name of the journal because it's not actually a Sage journal, but the title of the article caught the eye of my colleague and fellow contributor at the Monkey Cage, Henry Farrell. And the title of the article is Opinion Backlash and Public Attitudes. Are political advances in gay rights counterproductive? So in this article, a team of political scientists used first an experiment embedded in a survey in which some people read news stories that described moves toward same-sex marriage initiated either by courts or by a legislature, and other people read stories that were unrelated to those topics. And then the scholars looked to see whether reading those stories about same-sex marriage actually led to a backlash in public opinion, and moreover, did it lead to a backlash among the groups that you would most expect to feel that way, such as evangelical Christians. In fact, they found no evidence of any backlash whatsoever. Then they had the good fortune to be in the field with a separate survey project in and around the Supreme Court's decisions about same-sex marriage in June of 2013. So here we have not just an experiment in a survey, but an experiment in some sense in the real world, and they could see whether, in fact, there was a backlash in public opinion as a consequence of the Supreme Court's decisions. And again, they found none. So at our instigation, they wrote up these findings. The findings were published 3 days after the oral arguments took place in the court. And at least in the first week, that post on the Monkey Cage was seen several tens of thousands of times, which is not a lot for the internet, but is a lot for an article that appears in the American Journal of Political Science. To me, this story showcases what I think are the strengths of contemporary social science. One is its rigor. Here you have a topic that Supreme Court justices are wantonly speculating about, and now we have a study that uses experimental methods, both in a survey and in the real world, to shed some light on this. The other strength that it, I think, demonstrates is the relevance of social science. It's rare that we can have social science that's ripped from the headlines in quite this way, and it doesn't have to be ripped from the headlines. But nevertheless, it shows that I think social science is tuned in to the salient issues and debates that we're talking about right now, whether it be same-sex marriage or economic mobility, as was featured on the front page of the New York Times yesterday, or child rearing, or national security, or any of these things. Social scientists study topics like these because social phenomena have, I think, a real and profound effect on the lives of people. Oftentimes, social sciences are compared, it's always usually an unfavorable comparison, to the hard sciences. The presumption being that the hard sciences are better science and also more relevant because hard scientists sometimes do things like invent medicines or microchips. And I think this is a false distinction. We cannot have good science without good social science. You can make a medicine in a laboratory, but it won't work if the population that needs the medicine lives in a country that does not have stable political institutions. And there's no way to get medicine to a population when the people who would bring that medicine would be stopped at checkpoints by warlords or any of the other things that we might associate with the lack of a functioning state. So we can make these medicines in labs, but they won't do us much good if we don't have a social science that can inform how do we build good political institutions, for example. So I think this demonstrates the need for the sciences to be working in concert with each other, and not for us to sit down and sort of say that these are the worthy sciences and these are the less worthy sciences. Moreover, as my colleague Henry Farrell has written in reaction to some of the pushback that the social sciences have received here in Washington, the absence of good social science is not no social science. The absence of good social science is usually bad social science. Someone's going to rush in and fill the void. And those of you who live and watch what happens in Washington know that the people who will do that usually are motivated not by the traditional concerns of social science, rigor, transparency, right, but by a partisan or ideological agenda. And so this is why I'm grateful in particular to SAGE, but also to other social science associations and universities who have advocated for the social sciences here in Washington. And I'm very pleased today to have this distinguished group of scholars who can showcase both the rigor and the relevance of social science. The first of the scholars that we'll hear from today is Bruce Bueno de Mesquita, who is the Julius Silver Professor of Politics at New York University and also a Senior Fellow Emeritus at Stanford's Hoover Institution. Bruce received his doctorate in political science from the University of Michigan and an honorary doctorate from the University of Groningen. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Council on Foreign Relations. He was a Guggenheim Fellow and the recipient of South Korea's DMZ Peace Prize. There's a joke in here that not long after receiving the DMZ Peace Prize, his next book was called The Dictator's Handbook, but but he's, of course, the author of that book and 18 others, many articles, and a number of other pieces in major news outlets. And we're very pleased to welcome Bruce Bueno de Mesquita. Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you. The Dictator's Handbook was a good fit to the DMZ Peace Prize. Anyway, I want to pick up a little bit on your comments before I begin mine. Abraham Lincoln founded the National Academy of Sciences. Abraham Lincoln was also the first attorney to make a statistical argument in front of the Supreme Court to buttress his economic claims, which were correct, that keeping bridges over the Mississippi to allow the railroad to pass over the river was economically more important than protecting paddle wheel steamers. So even going back to Abraham Lincoln, we see that the opportunity for social science to have real impact was fundamental. I'm an odd person in many ways, but in particular with regard to having any impact in the policy world, because I do very abstract, mathematical, basic research using game theory to try to model complex decision-making. And by the way, that is the hard science. Physics is pretty easy. Now, when I started doing that kind of work, the general notion in the political science community is that couldn't be relevant to anybody. It's not, we can't do the math, so it must not be true that people think this way, and surely this can't be of any value. To me, there are three pillars to research. One person doesn't have to engage in all three, but somebody has to engage in each of the pillars. And the three pillars are developing theory, that is, proving logically that a claim is consistent, demonstrating empirically across a large body of cases that the logical implications of the theory are consistent with the way the world works, and then applying those implications in real-world situations before the answer is known, daring to be embarrassed by predicting and identifying, where appropriate, how to engineer policy outcomes. And I have, with some success or not, that's what I do. I'd like to emphasize what I view as the critical element that social science does bring to the policy community. So I want to make a very sharp distinction between normative matters and positive matters. In a democracy, the job of our elected officials is to decide what the policy objectives are and to attempt to achieve them. And to the extent that a social scientist wishes to engage in that third pillar that I talked about, daring to be embarrassed, daring to be out there before we know the answers, and offer analytic advice and prediction, to the extent that that's what they want to do, a job of the social scientist is to help the policymaker work out how best to achieve the goals, not based on ideology, not based on partisan preference, based on logic and evidence. Here is a problem. You want to get to this endpoint. Here is what we know about how to solve that problem, grounded in logic and evidence. Here is what I recommend are the actions that you take. So what I would like to do with the time I have today is offer examples so that people understand it is not pie in the sky to use rigorous logic and evidence as a social scientist to have an effect on really hard policy questions. I've been doing that more or less for a little bit more than 35 years. I was very, very young when I started, about 2 or 3. So let me give you some examples. For odd reasons, when George Shultz was Secretary of State, I was asked if I could figure out analytically how to keep Taiwan in the Asian Development Bank when China asked for admission. Wallace had, before becoming Undersecretary under George Shultz, Undersecretary for International Economic Affairs, had been the Chancellor of the University of Rochester, where I was teaching at the time. He was a mathematical statistician. He understood much better than I did what I was doing, and so he thought maybe I could design a model and solve this problem. And as it happens, I did. I irritated a lot of State Department China experts in the process, but it remains the case today that the Asian Development Bank is the only major international organization in the world in which both China and Taiwan are members. Because of that piece of work, William Casey, then the director of intelligence, asked me if I could use my modeling, game theory modeling, to figure out how to get Marcos out of the Philippines, replace him with a democratic government, not let credit for his removal go to the leftist guerrillas, and have the hand of the American government be invisible. The latter part remains classified, but the rest has been published. And I designed a strategy. It was not that clever. It was pretty straightforward. This was in the period where the Pope had said the church should be out of politics, because in Latin America there was a lot of liberation theology, which the Pope didn't like. But in the Philippine case, the modeling indicated that we could pull out of Marcos's coalition and relay and a bunch of generals, I don't have to go into the names, a bunch of generals, if we could get, what a great name for a cardinal, Cardinal Sin. Hey, that was, his mother named him, not me, you know. If we could get Cardinal Sin to take a position near Cory Aquino's position politically, not endorse her, but endorse a position close to hers that would give the supporters of Marcos room to move. And that brought down Marcos. We got the Khmer Rouge to lay down their arms and allow an election in Cambodia that they knew they would lose by using game theory reasoning. We run the clock forward. I published a paper in a Sage journal in 1990. I had a very hard time, by the way, publishing that paper. I need to talk to some of the editors. I send something, you know, bam, it should go in. We don't need all this reviewing. Sorry. I sent a paper published in 1990 using a simple game theory model to identify the conditions under which the Israeli government would agree to the creation of a semi-autonomous Palestinian entity led by Yasser Arafat. Now, I'm particularly proud of that. I want to reiterate, this was published in 1990. The paper also said that this process of creating the semi-autonomous entity would result in the collapse of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and be replaced by a then rising organization that was pretty much unknown called Hamas. What I'm proud of in that study is the dare to be embarrassed component. This was published in 1990. If you read the standard accounts of the creation of the Palestinian semi-autonomous entity, they tell you this was a product of the Second Intifada and the Oslo Accords in 1993. 3 years after the paper was published, and every detail in that analysis was borne out by what happened in reality. They simply had it wrong. If we run the clock forward, the same sort of modeling was used on behalf of our government. Each of these has been on behalf of our government. The CIA. That's the Culinary Institute of America. And some other government agencies, to solve a bunch of other problems. 2003, was it possible to predict Al-Qaeda tactics and targets over a 6-month window? This was a tournament, by the way. The Defense Threat Reduction Agency brought in 7 different groups of social scientists. They understood that social science was a way to think about these things. And we had a little tournament of different methods to see what would be most effective. It happened, my particular model was most effective, but I'm sure on many other occasions the others were. It happened to work out and predicted some very detailed information about di- division between al-Zawahiri and Osama bin Laden within al-Qaeda that was subsequently used to leverage policy. In 2007, the National Intelligence Council asked, and by the way, an interesting little aside, I did a TED talk in February 2009 on exactly the subject of the study done for the National Intelligence Council, which is the most senior body of intelligence officers in the country. The TED talk was based on undergraduate data and was absolutely as accurate and as detailed as the stuff that was done for the NIC with access to very, very hush-hush data. Social science doesn't need hush-hush, it needs good theory. Anyway, so in that study, and in the talk, the TED Talk, I was asked to analyze over several years the likelihood that the Iranian government was going to build and possibly use a nuclear weapon. This study is particularly interesting because, I'm a person with opinions. And my opinion was entirely different from what my study reported. I view my job as a social scientist in the environment of talking to policymakers as reporting what is grounded in logic and evidence, not opinion. So I didn't report my opinion. What the study said was that there was intense domestic opposition to building a nuclear weapon coming from the business community, the petroleum industry, a portion of the Revolutionary Guard, and a group called the Bunyads, who control about a quarter of Iran's economy and are immune by law from taxation and from corruption charges. How do you get to be one of those guys? So the study said that these guys were imposing so much pressure on the harder line leaders in Iran that the Iranian government was unlikely to do more than develop a research quantity of weapons-grade fuel and not build a weapon. This was a very poorly received result because I didn't know it at the time, but when I did the briefing, it was in the afternoon of a day where this same group of people had written a national intelligence estimate saying that Iran would have a nuclear weapon within 9 months. The critical element to this story is what happened then. What was my function as a social scientist using models and evidence grounded from the model in discussing it with these folks? It was to say exactly what I did say to the person who was the main objector. Van Diepen was then the head of nonproliferation and is now a deputy undersecretary of defense and has become a friend. He wasn't that day. And what I said to him was, look, we can't be arguing about the data. It's your data. We can be arguing about assumptions. My assumptions are explicit, okay? You might have to be able to read equations to go through the details, but I can explain to you the logic that I used. What is the logic that you used with the same data to come to the opposite conclusion? Well, the meeting broke up unpleasantly, and 2 days later he sent me an email. It was the beginning of our friendship. He sent me an email that said, I go to briefings by consultants all the time, and I shake their hand, and I thank them, and I never give them another thought. I haven't slept for 2 nights because of you, he said. And in particular, I haven't slept because I have been struggling to answer your question. How did I arrive at my conclusion with the same data that was available to you? And what he ultimately said is what I accused him of at the briefing. I'm not the most delicate person, which was, this is what you want to believe. It's your opinion. And you have then shaped what you've looked at to reach the conclusion you want. I happen to share as a personal opinion the view, but my model says it's wrong. I go with the logic and the evidence. He did something near to unprecedented. A month later, he issued a new national intelligence estimate, big parts of which were published in the New York Times, that said that the United States intelligence community had no evidence since 2005 that Iran was trying to build a nuclear weapon. They reiterated that, by the way, though the press doesn't cover it, in 2011 and again in 2013. And I would just observe that here we are 8 years later, and there is still no inevitable Iranian nuclear weapon. releasing that study to the New York Times tied George W. Bush's hands. He had been thinking that he would take out the nuclear facilities by bombing them. The issuance of the second National Intelligence Estimate, which Van is happy to say was based on this analysis, tied his hands. It precluded him from starting a war with Iran. In my view, that is what social science can do for the policy community, and from time to time has done. And it is able to do it because organizations like SAGE are willing to publish hard, technical, basic research that can turn into practical, applied work that maybe sometimes can make a little bit of a difference in the world. Thank you, and thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Next, we're pleased to welcome Claire Renzetti, who is the Judy Conway Patton Endowed Chair in the Center for Research on Violence Against Women, and also a professor and chair of the Department of Sociology at the University of Kentucky. She is a founding editor of the SAGE journal Violence Against Women, and has, of course, authored and edited many other books and book chapters and articles on this subject. Her research into violence against women has focused primarily on socially and economically marginalized women, and more recently on the role of religiosity in the perpetration and victimization of violence, as well as the potential therapies that might, in some sense, remediate the consequences of that violence. We're very pleased to welcome Claire Renzetti.
Thank you, John, and thank you all for being here this morning. I'm delighted to join you. I'm going to begin by telling a little story. There's no international intrigue, no CIA or anything. It's a story I like to call, "What if you start a journal and nobody submits a manuscript?" It's one of my favorite stories. It starts in 1994. Terry Hendricks, who was then an acquisitions editor at SAGE, invited me to edit a new journal that he was starting that was going to be called Violence Against Women. And when he asked me to do this, I was excited, and I was honored, and most of all, I was terrified. Because the question I kept asking myself was, what if we launch this journal and nobody submits any manuscripts? And I was even more afraid because the plan was to launch the journal 8 months after we signed the contract. So I had to have a journal in print in about 8 months, a journal issue. My worries, though, fortunately, were quickly proved unfounded, since within 3 years of publishing the first issue in 1995, we increased from quarterly publication to bi-monthly publication. And by the 5th year, we were publishing monthly. And even though our acceptance rate has remained consistently low, and those of you who know journal publishing know that's a good thing, you want it to be low, we have enough of a backlog to increase production even more, and next year I'm hoping we'll go to 14 issues a year. So obviously, there is no shortage of outstanding research in the field of violence against women. And to some extent, this is a result of the passage of the Violence Against Women Act in 1994. VAWA mandated funding for research, especially research to evaluate and improve the criminal justice response to violence against women. In fact, between 1995 and 2012, which is the last year for which I have data, Congress appropriated nearly $70 million for research and evaluation in the area of violence against women. And much of this funding was awarded through and administered by the National Institute of Justice. So to say that this law and the research that has helped to fund have been impactful is truly an understatement. This research is not research to satisfy some idle academic curiosity. This is purpose-driven research. It is translational research. So I want you to consider some of the examples of this type of research and what it has addressed. Since the early years of the anti-violence against women movement in the 1970s, advocates and service providers have urged law enforcement and the courts to to take violence against women seriously. And for many, this meant that police officers should arrest abusive intimate partners when they respond to a call for help, instead of what they historically had done, which was to talk to the perpetrator, like do on-the-spot counseling, for instance, or to separate the partners for a period of time, and then they were back together at home. Using data from the Minneapolis domestic violence experiment and the subsequent spouse assault replication program, VAWA encouraged jurisdictions to favor arrest as a response to domestic violence. And so many jurisdictions adopted mandatory arrest or pro-arrest policies that required or strongly encouraged police to make an arrest when responding to a domestic violence call, in the belief that this would make victims safer and it would also reduce recidivism. But continued research to evaluate these policies revealed that the police were sometimes arresting victims instead of abusers, or they would arrest both victims and abusers, which is a problem that's known as dual arrest. In their defense, the police maintained that they couldn't always determine who the abuser was when they were responding to a call. And if you think about this, it makes sense, right? Because the police are responding and they have to make a decision very, very quickly. And they're told you have to arrest if you're responding to a domestic violence call. And they get there and the partners are probably still fighting, or it's still a very highly charged emotional scene. The victim may have defended herself against the perpetrator and fought back. So what the police see is evidence that an assault occurred by both partners. And so they arrest both partners on the basis of that evidence. We also discovered that abusers became wise to mandatory arrests pretty quickly and would sometimes call the police before their partners did and claim that they had been assaulted. I was an expert witness on a case recently in which a woman had been arrested for stabbing her husband, but she had no recollection of doing this. And what had happened was he called the police while he was driving himself to the hospital, to the emergency room, and he said, "My wife stabbed me. She's still at our house. I'm terrified of her. I'm going to the hospital for treatment. Please go to the house and arrest her." When the police got there, she was sort of befuddled and she wasn't quite sure what was going on. And as the case unfolded, it turned out that he had hit her on the head with the handle of a gun, and she actually was unconscious for a while, and then he stabbed himself. And I listened to the 911 call that he made, and I looked at the photographs of his stab wounds, and he really did a very bad job. And I said to the attorney for her, what you need is not really me. What you need is an expert in wounds and infliction of wounds. And it was learned that he had stabbed himself and claimed that she had assaulted him. So these problems of dual arrest and arrest of victims cause great concern among researchers in the violence against women field. One concern was that victims, of course, could be discouraged from calling the police for fear of being arrested themselves, especially if they had defended themselves against an abuser. And I had asked victims in a number of studies, did you ever defend yourself against the abuse? And they would look at me like I was crazy, and they would say, what would you do? Would you stand there and just allow this to happen to you? Of course I defended myself. So it was very, very likely that the victim had, in fact, fought back. So these concerns became catalysts for additional research to, again, improve police responses. For instance, through training on how to identify the primary aggressor and distinguish this from self-defense. In addition, we studied how to establish specialized domestic violence units within police departments to include victim advocates when the police were responding to a call. And we evaluated the effectiveness of what's called a coordinated community response, in which police and prosecutors, healthcare professionals, service providers, and victim advocates collaborate and work together to provide a multifaceted response to perpetrators, to victims, and to their children. Another important area of investigation has been teen dating violence, with research focusing on the extent of the problem of violence in teen dating relationships, risk factors for teen dating violence, and evaluation of prevention and intervention programs specifically designed for teens, because these programs need to be age appropriate. These studies have shown, for example, that among the most significant risk factors are a 5-year age gap between dating partners, the use of alcohol or drugs by one or both partners, and participation in other high-risk adolescent behaviors such as gang involvement. In addition, there's currently longitudinal research underway to examine if childhood bullying behavior evolves into sexual harassment and teen dating violence, and the factors that appear to contribute to this trajectory. And of course, a major focus of current research is the use of technology and social media to perpetrate sexual harassment and various forms of victimization, such as revenge pornography, and by dating partners or former dating partners. Research in the area of sexual violence has revealed the extent to which we previously underestimated the crime of sexual violence. By simply changing the wording of one question from "Have you ever been raped?" which very few people wanted to admit or didn't know what had happened to them was rape, to "Has anyone ever forced you to have sex when you didn't want to?" we learned that 1 in 7 women have been raped in their lifetime, not the 1 in 20, as previously thought, but that only about 15 to 20% of rape victims report their crime to law enforcement. We've also learned that having sexual assault nurse examiners, or what we call SANEs, available in emergency rooms improves evidence collection and results in more positive outcomes for sexual assault victims, and that jurisdictions that have included SANEs on sexual assault response teams, or SARTs, see higher victim participation in the criminal justice process, and therefore better conviction rates, as well as positive outcomes for victims. Most recently, researchers, practitioners, advocates, and policymakers came together on the White House Task Force to Protect Students from Sexual Assault. And Congress is currently considering passage of the Bipartisan Campus Accountability and Safety Act, which, among other mandates, requires universities to conduct annual surveys of their students regarding their experiences of sexual violence on campus. Clearly, the violence against women field is one in which there is a strong synergistic relationship between practitioners, policymakers, and researchers. VAWA certainly contributed to the development of this relationship, but it's really important not to forget that researchers and practitioners work together tirelessly for the passage of VAWA and have continued to lobby for reforms with every reauthorization of that law, and currently as Congress deliberates the merits of the Campus Accountability and Safety Act. But the reach of this relationship goes beyond our national borders. Violence against women research, service, advocacy, and public policy are global in scope. Human trafficking, female genital mutilation, honor killing, dowry murders, and child marriage, in addition to intimate partner violence and sexual assault, are receiving increasing attention in countries throughout the world, including in the lawmaking bodies of these countries, again, because of collaborations between researchers, service providers, and advocates. And equally important, these collaborations are interdisciplinary. I don't know of many problems that we could address effectively if we only look at it from one discipline or through the lens of one perspective. We learned early on in the violence against women field that to develop effective responses to this multidimensional problem requires an interdisciplinary approach. So in the journal Violence Against Women, you're going to find research by sociologists and criminologists and psychologists and social workers, all the usual suspects, all the disciplines that you'd expect. But you're also going to find research by nurses and public health professionals, by economists, and by communications and media specialists. So it's hardly surprising that the subtitle of the journal Violence Against Women is an international and interdisciplinary journal. The journal is now in its 21st year of publication, and as the founding editor, it feels good to look back and see how far we've come in this field in just 2 decades, and to know that the work that we've published has made a contribution to these achievements. But we are very far from success, if by success we mean that women throughout the world are able to live their lives free of fear of being victimized by gender-based violence. I can tell you that none of us are patting each other on the back at this point because we still have a long way to go. But nevertheless, we're heartened by the progress that's been made. And so on behalf of the researchers, practitioners, and advocates who have published their work in violence against women, I really have to take this opportunity to express our gratitude to Sarah Miller McCune and to Sage Publications for the leadership role they've taken in the dissemination of groundbreaking, cutting-edge research that has informed and in many cases transformed public policy on gender-based violence in the United States and throughout the world. So congratulations on your 50th anniversary and best wishes for continued success over the next 50 years. I probably shouldn't say this, but hopefully by then, my journal will be out of business. Or better yet, we'll have changed the title to something like Women Living Safely and Fearlessly, an international and interdisciplinary journal. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Our next presenter is John Criswell, who's a professor of educational psychology at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. He's authored many books and articles on mixed methods research, qualitative methodology, and research design. His newest book is a SAGE book called A Concise Introduction to Mixed Methods Research, and he's also the founding co-editor of the SAGE Journal of Mixed Methods Research. Among his many accolades and honors include working with the National Institutes of Health to develop best practices for mixed methods research, to being the president of the Mixed Methods International Research Association, and as well the director of the Mixed Methods Academy at the University of Nebraska. I can say from my little corner of political science that if I had $1 for every article or dissertation that wants to use mixed methods, I'd be retired and somewhere else today perhaps. So it's a really a wonderful thing to welcome an expert in this area. Please welcome John Criswell.
Well, thank you, John. Very nice. Sarah, it's my pleasure to be here. Genevieve's done a great job organizing this. My editor and publisher, Vicki Knight, is somewhere here in the audience. Vicki Knight and Blaze, it's good to see you again here. Yesterday I flew in, and the senator from Nebraska wanted to come to this event. Deb Fisher, Senator Deb Fisher, and she said she couldn't come, so she said, why don't you bring John over to my office? So I spent yesterday afternoon visiting with my senator. She walks into the room. She'd obviously had a very busy day. She was kind of frowning a little bit, and she opens up with this question: well, what can you do? What can I do for you today? Which is probably a pretty typical question. And I go, well, really nothing. I'm just here for the SAGE celebration of their 50th anniversary. I'm just going to have fun for the next couple of days. And by the end of our session, she was smiling and laughing, and I was able to put in a little plug for Mixed Methods and for SAGE. I want you to think for a moment about what a researcher might look like and what he or she might be doing. A researcher. So this might be a person in a broad brim hat walking through the jungles as an anthropologist might be doing, right? Or it might be somebody in a laboratory in a white coat, like Thomas Edison, experimenting with all these different materials that could go into the generation of the light bulb. It might be a student in the computer lab crunching the data. So here's the message I want to give you today, that we're all very close to research. When we gather information to understand this world that we're in, we are gathering both numbers and statistics and the stories of people. So stories and numbers. And the research methods that I do will put those two together. Let me illustrate. I'm going to take you back to 2 years ago, just about this time. The Boston bombing at the Boston Marathon. Now, you can look at the numbers and statistics about the Boston Marathon. For example, there were about 23,000 runners that day in the Boston Marathon. Over $805,000 in prize money. There were 71 wheelchair and 52 wheelchair contestants. The bombing went off at 2:50 in the afternoon, killing 3 people and wounding 170. And you know, they took these wounded people around to the different hospitals in Boston. Brigham and Women's Hospital, 31 people. Mass General, 31. Boston Medical, 23. Beth Israel, 21. Boston Children, there were 10, ages 2 to 12, that went to that hospital. You may also know that the first responders that day were some doctors that I was working with over at the Harvard Humanitarian Institute. They were the first responders out to the hospitals. Of course, these are people that are going around the world and responding very quickly to medical crises. And it was written up in the Boston paper how these medical doctors from the Harvard Humanitarian Institute really helped save lives because they were out there immediately. Now, I've got to tell you about myself here. I was at mile marker number 23. That morning, I decided not to go down to the finish line, fortunately. And at this mile marker 23, it was at a large intersection. There must have been 1,000 people there. And they had these large speakers that were blasting music. YMCA was one of the songs. And another one was Sweet Caroline. And as these runners ran past us, they actually started smiling at this 23-mile marker. You know, this is when they're very, very tired. They were smiling, they were laughing. We actually uplifted their spirits. And then a little bit later, I was standing at the same spot. And these individuals were walking past me. What happened was they were turned around at mile marker 24 and told to go back. And then they were given blankets. And so these people were walking past me in shock with their heads down, trying to understand this tragedy. Now, what I've just given you is a mixed methods research rendering of the Boston Marathon event. First, I started with the numbers, and then I told my personal story. Now, if you had just heard my personal story, you may not know about the number of runners and the prize money. If I had told you about the numbers, you may not have gotten the personal story. So what I'm going to do now is put the numbers together with the stories in a new form of research called mixed methods research. And I think you'll see how this is very close to your everyday experience. Turn on CNN or any TV news broadcast, and you will get both the numbers and stories about the earthquake in Kathmandu, Nepal. You know, where they're interviewing people that have survived, and they're also giving you the statistics, the numbers and statistics. When you go into your doctor's office, I want you to think about getting the numbers in terms of the values of your cholesterol count, as well as that doctor asking you about what you've eaten. Tell us the story of it. A mixed methods rendering. The next time you go to a sporting event, be aware that often there is a play-by-play numbers-oriented commentator. And seated right next to this person is a person often called the color commentator that's telling the stories. It's a mixed methods broadcast of this sporting event. Or an example that I used at the National Music Therapy Conference last November. When you play music, you're doing a mixed methods rendering. For example, we all know how to count when we play the piano, the rhythm, the numbers. But we also know it's important to phrase our notes within measures. We're telling the story. So music, as it's performed, is a mixed methods rendering. Developing documentaries. We have a lot of excellent documentaries. I've been working with a friend of mine who has an award-winning documentary out about the Turkish people in Germany. He begins by relating the numbers of the Turkish people living in the country and some of the economic conditions using numbers, and then he goes into some of the stories that people told us. He's doing a mixed methods documentary. And even as John started his introduction today talking about same-sex marriage, he said, you know, there are people doing the surveys, and then you said there are real-world gatherings. So the stories as well as the numbers to understand same-sex marriage. It's in our everyday lives, isn't it? This idea of putting together numbers and stories is the research methods called mixed methods research that I've been working on with SAGE for almost 20 years. There was a mathematician in South Africa that said, here's what mixed methods is to me. It's two hands coming together, and he stood in front of my workshop and put his hands together like this. The stories and the numbers coming together to tell a complete picture. When we were presenting in Tokyo, Japan on mixed methods about a year ago, one of the participants walked up to the whiteboard and said, here's what mixed methods is to me, and drew an equation. 1 + 1 = 3. In other words, the sum of gathering the stories and the numbers is more than just each one individually. It gives us 1 + 1 = 3. This is an approach to research that is built on a very simple idea. It started about 1985 to 90. There were 8 people around the world that came to the same conclusion. We were all working independently, that if you put quantitative and qualitative research together, you would have something larger. Some of these individuals were evaluators, sociologists, some were from the health sciences. I was working from the field of education. When I published my first SAGE book in 1994 called Research Design, I had a little chapter in there called Combining Quantitative and Qualitative Research, Combining Numbers and Stories. I got more emails from around the world on that one chapter than any others. I knew I was on to something. So what's happened now is from this very simple idea of putting numbers and stories together has grown a complete way of doing research called mixed methods. And it's expanded since those early days of the 1985 to 1990. The innovations. We now have a mixed methods question. We have diagrams of procedures. We have types of designs. We have ways to write up these stories and these studies. We have webinars. Next week, I'll be giving a webinar across the country to health science researchers on mixed methods. We have online courses in mixed methods research. We have a Facebook page with our national association. We have a Twitter page. I've been developing a new app that would go up on an iPhone to help a person decide what kind of mixed methods design might be used. So what's been happening here is that this mixed methods concept, simple idea that now has developed into a way of doing research, has expanded among disciplines and around the world. I'm going to start with a policy example. I was speaking to the Boston Health Commission. I had all the commissioners across the city in the room talking about mixed methods research, and They were telling me about a survey they had done where they got very confusing and conflicting results. So I could stand up and say, well, why don't you follow that up with some qualitative interviews, some stories? So you see that model, quantitative followed by qualitative. Another example from Boston. We're working on an NIH project with the Bhutanese and the Somali refugees in Boston. We're studying how families cope and how they work with their children that have come to this new country of America to live. In that project, we're starting with interviews, the stories. We want to find out how they're thinking about working with their children in this new community. And then we're going to administer some instruments that might be culturally appropriate. Qualitative stories, followed by quantitative surveys. In the field of family medicine, I'm working now with a project out of NIH that is looking at cardiovascular prevention in 2,000 family medicine practices all across the country. This is a mixed methods project where people are gathering both interview data and survey data to understand how these practices can better address cardiovascular disease. In Bangkok, Thailand, I was speaking to the researchers doing tourism, and there they want to find out how best to enhance tourism within the country, and they're using both surveys, the quantitative numbers, as well as the qualitative stories. In South Africa, I've been working with the researchers studying AIDS that go into the townships. They're looking at the stigmas attached to young women, especially in those small communities. They're gathering both the stories through videotapes as well as the numbers through the surveys. Here back in the United States now, I chaired a commission developing guidelines for NIH on best practices in mixed methods in the health sciences. We put our report up on a website, and within 3 weeks, there were 19,000 hits on that website, making it the most heavily hit website at NIH in recent history. The director of the Office of Behavioral and Social Science Research, which is an office over all of the institutes and the centers at NIH, got up at the end of a workshop on mixed methods and implementation science to say, this is the next methodology of the future for the social, behavioral, and health sciences. That was his closing point. When we founded the Journal of Mixed Methods Research, a SAGE journal in 2007, it obtained an impact score within a record 2 years. And an impact score measures the prestige of a journal. So SAGE's role has been instrumental through all these years. They've started the major journal. They've published my books. I've been told that the book that I wrote with Plano Clark is industry standard. And this is the most recent book I've written. How many authors carried their own books around with them? But I've got to tell you about this book. This is more than just a book. And I'm not trying to promote it here, but I want to put it into the stream of what's developed in terms of mixed methods thinking here in the United States and around the world. I wrote this book in a way that it could be read in 2 to 3 hours, and I can document that. It's a short book, a short read. Why did I do that? I was working at Harvard, and I had a lot of medical doctors in my groups that I was consulting with, and they can't turn to a 400-page book and digest it quickly. They need something to get into the topic very quickly. Furthermore, I asked SAGE to sell this for $20. So it's very inexpensive. It's the same price that my research design book was when it came out in the early 1990s. And furthermore, it's up on a Kindle now. And most importantly, it's a short introduction to this field that is expanding around the world so that it can be translated into many languages, which it's doing right now. And so at a certain point in the evolution of how we do research, sometimes putting together something in a very concise way can help expand interest and help move it out around the world and across the social sciences. So you see, from a very simple idea that's in our everyday experience, putting together stories and numbers, has now expanded a research methodology that we all can understand, right? And it's grown through the strategies that SAGE has helped, through the journals, through the books, through the endorsements. And we now have a new methodology that may well be the wave of the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. When I wrote this book about the 2012 presidential election, I went to Iowa for the caucuses and had dinner one night in a Pizza Ranch restaurant in Altoona, and just so I could go to a Rick Santorum rally. And of all the experiences I had writing that book, I would not trade anything for the chance to have gone to that Pizza Ranch in Altoona, Iowa, if for only to see the juxtaposition of pizza and a ranch, right, in one restaurant. To me, the stories and the numbers had to come together in just that way. Our next presenter is Michael Reich, who is the Daniel Thirst Distinguished Professor of Social Justice at the University of Maryland and currently a visiting scholar at the University of California in Berkeley. He's a Woodrow Wilson Fellow and a Fulbright Scholar, and has published a lot of books and monographs, including the SAGE book, Social Policy and Social Justice. He currently serves on 5 editorial boards, which I congratulate him and sort of empathize with him for that role. And he's played an important role in advocating for issues related to poverty and inequality for vulnerable populations, including low-income families and welfare recipients and immigrants and refugees and the homeless. And he's been honored for this work in policy advocacy by many groups, but including the National Association of Social Workers. So please join me in welcoming Michael Reich.
Thank you very much, John, and congratulations, Sarah and Sage, for your 50 years of amazing work. And I want to also give a shout out to the editor with whom I've worked now for 8 years, Cassie Graves, for all of her support and for her commitment to the issues that make SAGE such a special journal. As a historian and a social worker, I'm going to tell a little bit different kind of a story. It's a collective story. There are a lot of actors in it, and it's also a story that has ebb and flow. And as someone who lives and works in Baltimore, within spitting distance of where the events of the past week occurred, I'm also speaking in a very personal way about what's been going on and what its implications are. So these recent events in Baltimore have focused the nation's attention not only on police-community relations, but once again, seems cyclical, on the causes, characteristics, and consequences of chronic poverty. However, as the response of some policymakers and some media outlets to these events demonstrate, longstanding assumptions about poverty persist. The need for social science research to revise these longstanding attitudes about the poor and about poverty is therefore more important than ever. Now, for millennia, societies attributed poverty to various things, to individual moral failure, to cultural deficiencies, or the absence of divine grace. During the past century, social scientists have attempted to revise these persistent myths with limited success. They have asked different questions, used diverse methods to demonstrate the actual nature and extent of poverty, identify its causes, analyze its short and long-term effects, and establish the relationship between poverty and race, poverty and gender, poverty and health, and even poverty and life expectancy. This research has produced some effective alternative policy solutions and most recently applied evidence to evaluate the interventions those policies have developed to address the symptoms of poverty. Now, my story begins in the late 19th century. The scientific charity movement at that time, responding in the aftermath of a devastating depression, represented the first systematic effort to identify the causes of poverty through social research. A study conducted in New York by Amos Warner refuted many of the prevailing judgments about the immigrant poor, even as they reflected late Victorian morality and elements of social Darwinism. Now, while the charities, organizations, societies at the time used this research to integrate a, quote, scientific approach into its work with poor individuals and families, researchers during the same era in the settlement house movement challenged the link between poverty and morality, focused on the environmental causes and effects of poverty, and used research as a tool for policy advocacy. In 1904, Robert Hunter, a settlement house worker at Hull House in Chicago, and later at the University Settlement in New York, completed the first scientific comprehensive study of poverty in the United States. Contrary to popular opinion, he found that many, if not most, of the poor were poor as a result of illness, unemployment, or old age. And this promoted, among elites anyway, public discussion of poverty and the need for comprehensive reform. During the next decade, other social work researchers like Mary Van Cleek, a fellow in the College Settlement Association of New York, and later the director of industrial studies at the Russell Sage Foundation, and Josephine Goldmark, a resident of the Henry Street Settlement in New York, produced a wide range of reports analyzing such issues as child labor, unemployment, and working conditions in factories, mines, and mills, particularly those which affected women and girls. Van Cleek's research drew national attention to the relationship between low wages and poverty, an issue that persists to this day, and to the absence of laws addressing unsafe industrial and social conditions. Josephine Goldmark was an aggressive investigator of these labor conditions, including the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, and wrote prolifically about the health effects of industrial work, low wages, and long hours. In the landmark 1908 Supreme Court case of Muller versus Oregon, she helped write the precedent-setting Brandeis brief, which used social science research in a Supreme Court brief for the first time. Their research led to laws banning child labor and also improving the hours of women and other workers. During this period, statistical research on juvenile delinquency and tenement housing by Edith and Grace Abbott, who were the first women admitted to the sociology factory at the University of Chicago, helped develop strategies to improve urban conditions. Ethnographic and community-based research by African Americans such as W.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, and George Edmund Haynes illuminated the stark conditions African Americans endured in both the urban North and the rural South, and brought issues such as lynching and chronic unemployment to the public's attention for the first time. Research by social workers at the Children's Bureau on maternal and child health ultimately produced the Shepard-Towner Act, the first federal health care legislation in 1921. And the combined impact of all of this social science research eventually provided the foundation for the policies that emerged during the New Deal. After the progressive era faded, however, three different approaches to the use of social science research emerged. Research in the child guidance movement, for example, blended psychodynamic theory into studies on delinquency. Used the earliest examples of what we now call intervention research to transform subjective charity work into objective social casework with families. This created the rational scientific framework for social work practice, which continues to be influential today. The newly formed health and welfare councils, which were created by the community chest movement, used survey research to promote strategies that could help millions of immigrants assimilate. Other community researchers, such as Mary Parker Follett in Cincinnati, Paul Kellogg in Pittsburgh, and Edward Lindeman in New York, used survey research for different purposes. They wanted to create what Mary Parker Follett called a new state and enhance civic participation among its members. And finally, during a decade in which the Ku Klux Klan reached the height of its political power, African American researchers continued to struggle to use their research to bring the consequences of individual and institutional racism into the mainstream of social concern. Now, this split among researchers, some of which continues to this day, existed even more strongly during the Great Depression. Helen Hall's studies of unemployment, that was sponsored by the National Federation of Settlements, demonstrated once again that the roots of unemployment and poverty were systemic, not individual. During the Depression, because so many people were unemployed, this drew a more sympathetic audience. University-based scholars and researchers in public welfare departments used more advanced statistical analyses for the first time, new qualitative research methods such as ethnography, and significantly, innovative ways to disseminate their research to illuminate the consequences of poverty and to promote a wide range of alternative solutions, from rural cooperatives to the first welfare state policies. Researchers in private family service agencies, however, the descendants of the charities movement, took a different approach. They focused on such issues as intergenerational conflict among immigrant families and emphasized the primacy of individual family relations. Now, ironically, nearly all of these researchers during the period of the Great Depression overlooked the specific conditions of women and racial minorities, the populations most affected by poverty. It took a book by a Swedish social scientist, Gunnar Myrdal, in 1944, titled Race: An American Dilemma, to demonstrate the connection between poverty and race to a wider audience. Now, these different approaches to research underscore three recurrent tensions among social scientists in the area of poverty research. One is the distinction between a problem focus that looks at individual causation and an environmental focus to poverty. Another dispute, in which I've been involved a little bit, is to what extent advocacy-oriented research violates principles of scientific investigation and the tenets of professionalism. A third is whether social science should provide the foundation for developing anti-poverty policies, or, as Daniel Patrick Moynihan once said, only for measuring their results. Now, in the aftermath of the Second World War, social scientists became, to use Christopher Lash's phrase, doctors to a sick society, while the repressive political climate of McCarthyism compelled social scientists to abandon the study of community and social issues. So as a result, by a little before SAGE was founded, by the end of the 1940s, the connection between research and social policy had largely disappeared. Now, ironically, this focus on individual deviance rather than environmental factors eventually produced research that asked, why does widespread poverty persist in an era of unprecedented prosperity? Now, this research over the next several decades took several forms. Richard Cloward and Lloyd Olin, sociologists, developed opportunity theory to revise traditional explanations about the causes of juvenile delinquency. Over 45 years ago, Andrew Billingsley published Children of the Storm, which analyzed the racial implications of the nation's child welfare system, a theme that Jonathan Kozol later examined in such books as Rachel and Her Children. Their work eventually led to programs that emphasized strengthening families as a means of protecting children's well-being. In the 1950s and 1960s, research by anthropologists Oscar Lewis and by Michael Harrington identified the patterns of cultural adaptation produced by chronic poverty. Now, their goal was to heighten Americans' awareness of the extent and consequences of poverty even during the post-war boom. But unfortunately, then and now, their culture of poverty thesis has been inverted by politicians and the media to explain the causes of poverty rather than the effects of poverty. This belief that cultural norms produce poverty continues to influence American attitudes today, as some of the coverage in the events of my hometown, Baltimore, demonstrated. Since the 1970s, social science research about poverty in the United States has largely focused on the conditions of specific marginalized populations: African Americans, single mothers, children in foster care. William Julius Wilson demonstrated the devastating consequences of deindustrialization on the African American community. Douglas Massey pointed out how public policies have created what he called American apartheid. Kathy Eden has studied the impact of mass incarceration on the ability of low-income women and men to form stable families. Public health researchers have revealed the long-term effects of poverty on physical and mental health. My work and the work of other colleagues has looked at the effects of welfare reform and healthcare reform, not only on the people who are the clients of these systems, but on the organizations, particularly small and mid-sized nonprofit organizations that are critical for people's survival in hard times. And even just yesterday, research in the New York Times highlighted the connections between children's poverty and the place where they grow up. Perhaps most powerfully, in terms of contemporary research, a colleague of mine at Washington University in St. Louis, Mark Rank, has found that a majority of Americans and 91% of African Americans are poor for an extended period in their lives. And we all know now what the devastating effects of an extended period of poverty are, particularly if people experience them in childhood. Isabel Sawhill has concluded that if we measured poverty accurately in the United States, about 100 million Americans would be considered poor. We can only speculate on the impact on American attitudes about poverty and the poor, particularly in light of recent events, if such findings were more widely disseminated. So how can research in the future be scientific and still serve the goal of social justice? So let me make a few suggestions. First, maybe we should study why these attitudes about the poor and poverty persist in light of a century of really good scientific evidence to the contrary. But maybe here are a few things that we could do. We could balance research on the effectiveness of interventions that address the symptoms of poverty with analyses of the relationship between these symptoms and the structural changes that are producing not only greater inequality, but more serious chronic poverty. We should create studies that enable marginalized populations to find their voice, to define their own realities through mixed methods research, for example, by making them full partners in all phases of the research. And finally, we could disseminate our findings more widely and more creatively to influence public attitudes and potentially influence public policy more effectively, and enable Americans to use these data to improve the quality of their lives, and particularly the lives of the least fortunate in our society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Next, we're pleased to welcome Deborah Rupp, who is a professor in the William Byam Chair in Industrial and Organizational Psychology at Purdue University. She conducts research on a wide range of topics, including organizational justice and corporate social responsibility. And her research has been cited by the Supreme Court, and she has worked with a variety of countries and other institutions, including UNICEF and the South Korean government, and although it's not said here, could be even maybe the Culinary Institute of America, we don't know. She's published a lot of books and papers in a variety of journals. She sits on the editorial board of 6 journals, take that, Michael, and she is the outgoing editor-in-chief of the Journal of Management. We're very pleased to welcome Deborah Rupp.
Thank you, John, for the introduction. Sarah, congratulations, and thank you for supporting 50 years of social science research. And thanks all of you for being here, allowing me to tell some stories about my field, industrial organizational psychology, or IO psychology. For those of you less familiar with this discipline, IO psychology is the scientific study of human behavior in the workplace. We apply psychological theories and methodologies to issues of relevance to individuals, organizations, and society. We seek to accurately estimate the cost and benefits of various sorts of work for employees, families, and organizations, and are experts in the areas of personnel selection, training, and program evaluation, and we often do such work on large scales, for example, for the military or within government agencies. As a result, our work makes significant contributions to our nation's economy, security, health, and well-being. My field, which is best represented by the Society of Industrial and Organizational Psychology, has a long history of doing work that is of relevance to policymakers and society at large. For example, we've recently had significant voice pertaining to the issues faced by older workers. This has included participating in the White House Conference on Aging, preparing invited comments for the United Nations Open Working Group on Aging, and coming up on May 12th, the presentation of a congressional briefing on issues pertinent to the aging workforce. In August, the Society held a congressional briefing focused on the science of recruiting, hiring, and training veterans returning to the civilian workforce. Similar briefings have been held on the psychological impact of furloughs, as well as the psychology of both unemployment and underemployment. But beyond briefings, the work that we do has had direct impact on issues of critical significance. Some salient examples have been IO psychologist Elizabeth Kolmsetter's work in rapidly recruiting, selecting, training, and onboarding the entire TSA workforce post 9/11, or Lori Foster Thompson's current role as a fellow on the White House Social and Behavioral Sciences team. But this forum is about personal stories, so I'm here to tell you mine. It's a story of organizational justice, ethics, and corporate social responsibility, issues of central importance to policy in that government is often in the business of upholding the rights of workers and citizens, quelling corruption, and protecting the natural environment. I started my career studying workers' experiences of unfairness or injustice in the workplace. Via both laboratory experimentation and field research that has been carried out by myself, my students, and my colleagues, this research has uncovered a number of insights. First, these experiences really matter. Large meta-analytic reviews, that is, statistical aggregations of hundreds of studies, which combined represent the responses of hundreds of thousands of employees across a wide array of jobs, industries, and locations, suggest that workers who feel fairly treated are healthier, happier, and more productive. They're also less likely to quit. On the flip side, when workers perceive themselves as having been unfairly treated, they show signs of stress. Both their health and productivity suffers, and there's an increased likelihood of a whole host of very damaging behaviors, such as theft, workplace violence, and increased turnover. Not to mention increased legal claims of harassment, discrimination, wrongful termination, and the like. The bottom line is that organizational justice, that is treating employees fairly, is good for both organizations and the people within them. As psychologists, we've sought to understand the origins of these reactions. Of course, people want to be treated fairly, but why? What are the motives that drive people to provide, seek, and react to justice and injustice in the workplace? Our research has uncovered three driving mechanisms. One, of course, is self-interest. We often seek fairness because, lacking complete information, it's the safest bet for maximizing our outcomes, or at least mitigating against being exploited. Here, the economists and the psychologists tend to agree. A second reason is more interpersonal in nature. It involves a psychological need for belongingness. Humans, as well as many other animals, need to feel they are valued by social groups, the workplace being a central social group and source of status for adult humans. It turns out that fair treatment sends a strong signal about this belongingness, and this has a strong impact on attitudes and behaviors at work. But it's the third reason where things get especially interesting, and where we move dramatically from traditional assumptions about economic self-interest and more toward universal, some would say hardwired norms of ethical behavior. That is, research shows that people expect other people to treat each other fairly, just because. And when these norms of social behavior are violated, people react with anger and punishment. Even Adam Smith, father of modern economics, has stated, how selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it. Daniel Kahneman, famed psychologist who was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics, was one of the first to show evidence of this. Through a series of experiments where research participants had to make a number of resource allocation decisions, he and his colleagues were able to set up scenarios whereby the only way to punish someone who had been unfair in past rounds was to take less resources for oneself. This pitted self-interest and ethicality against each other. And in fact, their results showed that people punished unfairness in the form of withholding future resources, even when that meant losing out themselves. This was a really important finding. It showed that individuals not only care about their own treatment, but they also react to the treatment of others, and that these more ethical concerns for justice can sometimes trump self-interest. My students, colleagues, and I have spent several years following up on this research. We've replicated these findings in the laboratory under a number of different scenarios, and we've detected these same behavioral patterns among working people and organizations. It seems people are not always only out for themselves. They certainly are at times, and often are, but they'll also react with hostility, reduced performance, and civil disobedience when they observe others being treated unfairly, even when they have nothing in common with the victim, and even when they stand to be in no kind of future relationship with either party. And they'll even sacrifice their own resources to do so. This was exciting. It broadened the way we thought about social justice in the workplace, but it still reflected a fairly myopic focus on employees and their treatment. Really, this was just the beginning. The real game changer for me personally came in the form of a student showing up to my office hours to pitch a term paper idea. She was from India, Jyoti Ganapathy, and prior to coming to university, had worked with a number of NGOs that partnered with organizations carrying out social responsibility initiatives. This was part of a larger corporate social responsibility, or CSR, movement that was really sweeping over the Indian landscape at that time. So her pitch. She wanted to integrate the largely sociological research on corporate social responsibility, CSR, with the psychological research on organizational justice. It seemed to make sense that if people care about and react towards how others are treated, then all of this psychological research could be applied to how various stakeholders react to organization CSR initiatives, which largely focus on others, local communities, foreign labor markets, others' access to natural resources. It could also be applied to stakeholders' negative reactions to corporate irresponsibility, corruption, fraud, human rights violations, labor exploitation, and the abuse of natural resources. And this is a big deal, right? 2/3 of greenhouse emissions are argued to come from 90 large corporations. 1,100 of the factory workers killed in the 2013 Bangladesh factory collapse were supporting U.S. garment operations. Recently, the New York Times has reported, this was just last week, Americans view wage inequality as one of the most salient issues facing our nation and world today. So this idea of applying what we know about workplace fairness to understanding the broader context of corporate social responsibility changed the course of my career. You see, the social sciences are often quite siloed. You have psychologists, sociologists, economists, political scientists, law professors, all studying issues with important implications for individuals, organizations, and society, but not necessarily sharing this work with each other or working together to answer large-scale questions. And that was the case here. I'm embarrassed to say when Jyoti pitched her idea to me to integrate justice and CSR, I found it confusing. Back then, to an organizational psychologist, CSR referred to customer service representatives. Micro and macro organizational scholars were paying little attention to each other's work. Work that, if properly integrated, could have much more to say to policymakers, such as yourselves, about how to more effectively influence ethical and socially responsible behavior within and among organizations than any single discipline was doing at the time. Thus, through the prodding of a diligent student, I began paying closer attention to what other fields of study had been uncovering over the decades on defining the role of business in society, exploring and expanding approaches to business that include not only profit-seeking, but also people and planet, known as the 3 Ps or the triple bottom line, and documenting the connection between a firm's social performance and its financial performance. But this search also led me to discover significant gaps in these literatures. The why. Why do various stakeholders put pressure on firms to act more socially responsible? Are the motives of firms engaging in CSR entirely self-interested? Is CSR behavior really an organizational phenomenon, or in order to understand, predict, and increase the social responsibility of organizations, do we also need to understand the competing interests, motives, and values of groups and individuals, both internal and external to organizations? The situation was screaming for an interdisciplinary approach. So I symbolically and quite literally left the psychology building at the University of Illinois and went on a hunt for top scholars in other disciplines in hopes of forging a multidisciplinary consortium of scholars focused on uncovering actionable insights related to corporate social responsibility. And the rest is history. So for the last 10 years, I've been working very closely with law professor Cynthia Williams, economic sociologist Ruth Aguilera, cultural anthropologist John Conley, and all of our collective students to explore not only what motivates individuals and groups, both internal and external to organizations, to put pressure on firms to be more socially responsible, but also to explore the ways in which norms and trends surrounding corporate social responsibility practices serve to regulate the behaviors of people and organizations. This, by the way, is why CSR is of such interest to the field of law and why the University of Illinois offered me a position in their law school. Laws are inherently about influencing behavior when punishment is viewed as the only route to compliance. Yet understanding the psychology underlying behavioral choices and motivations has uncovered routes to social influence that both don't require the force of the law and may be more effective in influencing widespread social change, of course, in the presence of various forms of formal regulation. CSR voluntary codes of conduct are examples of this, and there are a lot of them, stemming from efforts of the UN, the ILO, the OECD, ISO, and various industry groups. So our multidisciplinary team has been quite busy. We first developed a comprehensive theory which applied the why justice framework I described earlier to map the self-interested, relational, and moral or ethical motives of individuals, organizations, nations, NGOs, and intergovernmental entities for pushing for increased social responsibility. And we begun to collect empirical support for our ideas piece by piece. My student, Jyoti, she headed back to India to collect data revealing that even among very rural, very low-paid, and often illiterate factory workers, the values of their employer mattered to them and manifested in the form of loyalty, commitment, and performance, even controlling for the extent to which their own basic needs were being met. Back in the Midwest, a number of experiments conducted in my lab and then replicated among samples of employees revealed that the extent to which job applicants view a potential employer as being socially responsible is predictive of their willingness to work for the company. Further, once employed, the extent to which employees view their employers as socially responsible is predictive of their own individual citizenship behaviors at work. A particularly interesting finding we've just uncovered within the last few months involves the antecedents of socially responsible behavior within organizations. You might think that one way to increase ethical decision-making in an organization would be to hire people you've determined, perhaps through testing or assessment or pre-screening of some kind, to be high on ethical traits or values. Whereas our research does show that those with more proactive personalities and an overall sense of felt responsibility engage in more ethical behaviors at work, this is not necessarily the only route to catalyzing such behaviors. That is, we find that a climate or culture of social responsibility can have a strong normative effect on ethical behaviors, such that even those without such personality traits can be moved towards increased ethical behaviors simply in reaction to their environment. One way such climates or cultures can be created is via leadership. We've argued that CSR initiatives provide leaders within organizations to connect with and empower employees in alternative ways. It provides leaders a way to express their more socially oriented values and provides employees more exposure to leadership, as well as providing them with leadership opportunities themselves. Through leadership development within the context of pro-social initiatives, both organizations and society are benefited. Broader still, our research has looked closely at the role of institutional investors in creating softer forms of regulation that have had the effect of organizations engaging in more socially responsible and environmentally sustainable behaviors. Banks want to mitigate risk in the context of lending. Social responsibility and environmental sustainability among the firms lent to or invested in can mitigate such risk. Our research has shown that banks requiring their client organizations to comply with social and environmental standards creates an external incentive for organizations to engage in CSR. But it does more than that. It also creates norms of behavior that our research has shown to trickle down and around to other aspects of organizational functioning not directly tied to the original investment, creating the types of climate and culture I mentioned just a moment ago. To provide a concrete example, and taking this one step further, Dutch Central Bank, which would be the equivalent to our Federal Reserve, is carrying out explicit interventions to influence their culture of corporate social responsibility. They've hired 8 organizational psychologists who work directly with Dutch bank boards, their CEOs, and the banks as a whole to track, give feedback on, and promote ethical decision-making within the Dutch banking industry overall. We currently have a proposal under review to study and evaluate this process more directly. So those are some highlights aimed at telling the story of one social scientist. I hope they've exposed you to the field of industrial organizational psychology. We've left some flyers on the table and an invitation to the congressional briefing next week for those of you who are local in the DC area. I hope that we've given you a sense of what we're doing to impact policy and society, and illustrated how we've gone about connecting with a number of other social science disciplines to more deeply understand the ways in which organizations engage with society. The social sciences are so well positioned to not only uncover insights regarding the intersection of business, social responsibility, and environmental sustainability, but also to provide guidance in terms of best practices and evaluation of social responsibility initiatives. We really can work together to make the world a better place for everyone, and I hope my story provides but one small example of that. Thanks.
Thank you, Deborah. We're pleased to welcome Jim Knight, who is an authority on the study of learning and teaching and coaching. He is the director of the Kansas Coaching Project at the University of Kansas Center for Research on Learning and the president of the Instructional Coaching Group. He's published widely in a variety of journals, and his most recent book is Focus on Teaching Using Video for High-Impact Instruction, which, if my teaching evaluations are any indication, would be a good idea. And students want to see more video and less of me, it seems, so I should probably read this book. Jim, thank you very much for being here.
Sarah, I don't think we've met before, so I just want to say how grateful I am and let you know that I'm, like everybody here, extremely busy. And the reason I came is because I'm profoundly grateful to the team I work with at Corwin. Elisa's here representing the team. I saw Dave here. There's Dave down there. I'm not an easy person to trust, but I trust those people. And I've come to really trust the group, and I'm grateful for them. I want to tell you a story. It has 3 characters, and the title is Invisible Children. First character is a 12-year-old girl, Diana. I've changed her name. I tell this story in a book called High Impact Instruction. Diana was a girl from Mexico, and her family moved to Beaverton, Oregon, and she went to school not knowing very much English. And when she got to school, she realized it was going to be a bit of a challenge. I think sometimes we underestimate what it must be like for a 12-year-old in a middle school to go to a classroom not knowing the language. I know I was asked when I was a graduate student to present in Japan for my dissertation advisor. And I remember the experience of not really being able to speak up and say what I wanted, and not really understanding the culture was unsettling for me, a university student who is an adult. I can only imagine what it would be like for, in this case, a very shy 12-year-old in a school that was, and middle school is an especially complex emotional place. And Diana was a pretty introverted child. She had this beautiful long hair, though, that was kind of a distinguishing characteristic for her. But unfortunately, her story gets a little worse. What happened was her family got lice, which happens in schools and sometimes. And her father got so frustrated that he shaved her head. And she had to go to school with this hoodie on. I could only imagine what it must be like to be 12 years old, wake up in the morning, look in the mirror as you brush your teeth, see all your hair gone, which was kind of like your defining characteristic as a beautiful thing. And so what she would do is she would wear this hoodie. And in the school, they had a policy that you couldn't wear hoodies, but for this girl I'm calling Diana, they ignored the policy. And what she tried to do is she tried to be invisible. She did everything she could to not be noticed. She was shy, she was quiet, and she was likely to drop out. There are lots of different ways of analyzing the number of students in America who drop out, but I think if you were to average them all together, you'd end up around somewhere like 25% of students don't graduate. That's 1 every 26 seconds. See, I've got numbers and a story. And the cost of dropouts, like Diana, where she did drop out, NPR did a program a few years back, which is still online and which is really worth looking at. They estimated that the cost of dropouts annually in the United States is $325 to $350 billion when you calculate things like incarceration, healthcare, social benefits, lost tax revenue. And she's one of those kids. Now, Diana's teacher is the second hero in the story, Sarah Langton, a wonderful teacher and science teacher in Beaverton, Oregon, in the school district. And Sarah, I've seen on video many times in interviews and watched her in workshops. And she's, like so many teachers, deeply committed. For her, it's an act of social justice to teach. And she really cares deeply about her students. And when I watched her interviews, she said how much it mattered to her. And I want to talk about the complexity of being a teacher as the second part of this story. Now, there's a great little article you can find online, Glauberman and Zimmerman, two researchers from Toronto, one from York and one from the University of Toronto, and they study the complexity of healthcare, but I think their ideas apply in other settings. I first ran into the book in Atul Gawande, or the article in Atul Gawande's Checklist Manifesto. They said there are different kinds of tasks. And I think this is extremely important if you're involved in policy to understand these distinctions. One kind of task is a simple task. Baking a cake, they say, is their example of a simple task. It's not for me, but for most people, baking a cake is a simple task. You follow the recipe, you get a cake. The second kind of task is a complicated task. A complicated task is one that involves an awful lot, but once you resolve it, you can keep doing it over and over again. So, for example, putting a person on the moon is a complicated task. Once you've done it, you can keep doing it. You've solved the problem, same things over and over again, you should get the same solutions. That's a complicated task. A complex task is teaching a classroom of students like Diana, because it changes all the time, because a recipe won't solve the problem. Ron Heifetz at Harvard talked about different kinds of challenges leaders face in organizations. He says there are technical challenges and there are adaptive challenges. Technical challenges address simple tasks and complicated tasks, but adaptive challenges require adaptive results. And the single largest mistake leaders can make, he says, is to take an adaptive or a technical solution and apply it to an adaptive challenge. If you try to put a recipe as a solution to the complexities of the classroom, he would say that's the worst leadership mistake you can make. So that's our second character, Sarah. The third character is Michelle Harris, who told me this interview and who welled up in tears as she told me this story as I interviewed him for the book, High Impact Instruction. Michelle is an instructional coach. She's worked with me for many years. And she's a voracious learner. I mean, she is relentlessly pursuing new ideas. And so she's a perfect coach, a person who is shoulder to shoulder, a second set of eyes, a person who works with the teachers. And Sarah had learned a few things about what work involved. One of the things is people aren't motivated by other people's goals. Look at the work of DC and Ryan in particular, but lots of people who look at motivation. My wife Jenny is here, and she said, Jim, I have got a great goal for you. You should go on this diet. Let's go. If she gave me the diet, it's not going to be nearly as motivating if I choose it for myself. And there's sufficient evidence to say, as the old saying goes, when you insist, I will resist. That people need to have a voice in what they do. And we had studied this. It was a big part of our training with our coach. Now, I should just tell you one more little tidbit here. Shane Lopez is a researcher at the University of Kansas, one of my colleagues, and he works primarily for the Gallup organization. He looked at surveys, over 100,000 surveys, to analyze a critical variable in whether or not you like your work, which is, does your voice matter at work? They analyzed the data from truck drivers, service workers in restaurants, doctors, architects. And he sat down with me in this little restaurant in Lawrence, and he said, Jim, guess who came at the bottom of the list, below service workers, below truck drivers? Teachers. In that survey of 100,000 people, teachers felt their voice counted the least. And there's ample evidence that for professionals, having a voice matters. Thomas Davenport's book, The Knowledge, People Who Think for a Living, he says, the defining characteristic of a knowledge worker is to want to have a voice, to be involved, to have autonomy. So Diana was the student, Sarah was the teacher, Michelle was the coach. And so Sarah came to Michelle and she said, I'm really busy, but I really need your help. I have a new curriculum and I'd really like to work with you. And so Michelle said, well, let's do it. And she started, and we have developed using design research over a period of time, a simple process that's adaptive and that positions the teacher as the decision maker, but nonetheless is accountable in the sense that it begins with a clear picture of current reality and leads to unmistakably positive improvements. And so what Michelle said is, why don't I come and I'll video record your class? And she video recorded the class. She loaded it onto the teacher's computer. And Sarah sat down and watched the video. And it happened to be the class Diana was in. And Michelle and her got together. And Michelle said, so what did you see watching the video? And she'd given her some tools to kind of analyze the video of her lesson. She said, Diana is not the only student trying to be invisible in that class. There are 7 other students in that class learning English, and none of them answered a single question. And I never realized it until I watched the video. And so they decided that they'd set a goal. And it's critical, I think, in change to have a very clearly articulated goal. And their goal was that at least 70% of the time, all students would participate. Diana couldn't be invisible. She had to be an active participant. And Michelle knows a lot of effective practices in instruction. She has what I call an instructional playbook, a set of high leverage, easy to understand, powerful practices that can make a difference. And she said, let's try talking tokens. And talking tokens is a simple thing. You give every student 3 tokens. When it's their turn to talk, they put it out there in the middle of the table. And that way you can make sure everybody talks a couple of times. That was the simple idea. And she explained it clearly, probably with a checklist, and made sure she understood it. And then they taught the practice to students, and they sat back excited to see what the results were. So what do you suppose happened? Well, what they had for tokens were dominoes. Some previous teacher had left hundreds of dominoes in the classroom. And so every kid got 3 dominoes. Now, do any of you have 13 or 12-year-old kids at home? What would happen if they had a stack of dominoes in front of them? They played dominoes. It had no impact. In fact, it was damaging to learning in the classroom. So they got back together and they said, well, that didn't work. What can we do next? And they said, well, let's try think, pair, share. Think, pair, share, where you pair kids up. And they thought really carefully about what students would be paired with which students. Diana was paired with a friend of hers, highly proficient in English, that she was comfortable talking with. And every highly proficient student was paired up with a kid who was struggling with English. And it turned out the problem was they didn't know the content. The problem was they weren't comfortable saying it. Diana was about 3 grade levels below reading by the end of the year. She was almost at grade level, according to my interview with Michelle. And I have a video of Michelle and Sarah talking, where Sarah, the teacher, turned to Michelle and she said, what does it mean that these students can do this now, that they know they can learn? Well, everybody has their own interpretations of stories, but what it means to me is this. First off, if we want teachers to be professionals, if we want professionals to teach our children, then we shouldn't treat them like skilled laborers. We should treat them like professionals, which means we give them a large element of autonomy. Autonomy in a process that has really clear processes to lead to real clear changes. But without autonomy, it's likely not going to happen. I don't get excited when other people tell me what to do all the time if I'm a professional. Years of experience, a degree, multiple degrees possibly. Second thing is, technical solutions don't solve adaptive problems. We can't come up with a recipe. As one author said, in education, it's never one size fits all, it's one size fits one. And we need to come up with processes that lead to unmistakable improvements, adaptive processes, and ours is instructional coaching, that have a really clear pathway, but that also respond to the situation. This bottle's getting me. What if the whole school decided everybody will use talking tokens? And that was their solution. They came up with a kind of recipe solution. Well, what would have happened is it wouldn't have made any difference. It would have made things worse in her class. It wouldn't have solved the big problem. And the last thing is a basic thing, which is that better teaching equals better learning, and that's good for all of us. And I think if we strive for finding ways to position teachers as professionals, and we give them simple processes that are accountable, and we allow for them to use their brains to solve their solutions, it can truly be better for all of us. So thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Finally, we're pleased to welcome Kara Carvey, who's an associate professor in the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University. She is also a playwright and a producer, and her work and research looks at a wide range of topics, including intercultural conflict, the effects of new media, digital storytelling, and the relationship between new media narratives and identity. She's done a variety of interesting work for the National Science Foundation and for the Smithsonian Institution on these topics. And most recently, she's been the general editor for the award-winning Sage Encyclopedia of Social Media and Politics. Please welcome Kara Carvey.
I always have to do this first. I'd like to begin my talk today by saying how deeply pleased I am to be part of this event. It's a very great honor, and I'm tickled silly to have been included. I'm also extremely aware that I am all that stands between you and the coffee break. So I promise you that I will be brief, although I would like to talk a little bit about the arc of my research over the last few years in social media and actually all types of new communications technology and society, and the way in which the increasingly short leash between those two things illustrates a couple of items that might be of interest to us today. The first of those items is the absolutely critical role of social science research in general, as well as research in the hard sciences, but also the importance of doing social science research both inside and outside of the formal academy, which is something you could talk about forever, but I promise I won't. In fact, I'll only tell you 3 very short stories. And we begin with the somewhat radical thought that today's internet is actually something of an imposter. Some of you may remember, as do I, when the internet was a very, very different thing than it is today. The internet, there are a lot of young people in the audience, so you'll just have to take my word for it. The internet was not cool. It wasn't cool, it wasn't groovy. On the other hand, it wasn't serious and hard-hitting and important. It was actually thought of as something a little bit strange. It was incurably geeky, for one thing, in a day and age when geek was not a power word. And it was also somewhat exotic. Not everybody had access to the internet, even at work, let alone at home. And in all honesty, not everybody even knew what it was. Of the people who did know what it was, most of them had actually helped to invent it or had seized upon it as a way to get out of having to pay the telephone company for long-distance calls. But one of the people who did know about the internet was Al Gore. And I don't know if he ever used it to circumvent Ma Bell, but I do know that he had big plans for it, although he wasn't the only one who had big plans for it. But so it was, because of Al Gore and other enthusiasms, so it was that in June of 1995, I got the phone call that every hungry young assistant professor in Washington, D.C. dreams of getting. It wasn't from Cyrus Bean, but it was from somebody who represented the White House. Or actually, it was from somebody who represented the White House, but they couldn't tell us who it was. And that was just, let me just say, thrillingly, unbelievably Washingtonian when you're 32 years old. So the reason for this phone call is that under a directive from the Gore-Clinton White House, the National Science Foundation was putting together a special task force to set an anthropological research agenda for the internet and related internet issues for the 21st century. They brought together about 30 of us from all the different fields, actually, that would have been involved: academics, inventors, innovators, slightly different thing, corporate entrepreneurs. And they wanted us to come up with a list of policy research questions for the internet for the next 100 years, which, kind of struck us as a tall order, but it was very exciting, and they were going to give us 3 days to do it. So they did that. They gave us 3 days. They locked us in the basement of St. James Hotel. Some of you may remember the St. James Hotel. It's now a GW dorm. We won't go there. They locked us in, and for 3 days, they shoved coffee and donuts under the door, and they hoped for the best. A lot of coffee and a lot of donuts. And at the end of those 3 days, we emerged, and what also emerged, probably no surprise, was a government report. Also a juried publication, because we were academics after all, and we lived for that. But even more importantly, what emerged was the sense that this internet thing was going to be even bigger than we'd bargained for. And that was before social media were even a twinkle in Mark Zuckerberg's eye. So we put together our list, and here's the big surprise about the list. 2 things. First of all, we got a lot of it right. We were stunned ourselves. NSF was hugely relieved. But what we had on that list actually turned out to be, quite a extensive and somewhat impressive compendium of questions to ask about research that could lead to policy changes. The second big surprise about that list is that it was very, very heavily social science oriented. We weren't all social scientists in that room consuming coffee and donuts. I would say probably 2/3 of us actually came from computer science, from what was going to turn into web design, from mathematics, from hard sciences, from that territory we now call STEM. But nonetheless, what we walked out with were lists of questions that had to do with how people live and how people interrelate, both with each other and with this sort of burgeoning technology. So I actually brought a copy of my publication too, but I left mine in my briefcase. However, I have notes from it, which I would like to now share. Pardon me? No, it's not. You can't get it online. POD online. Here are just a few of the things we highlighted in that 1995 report, and I want to share them with you today because some of them might sound a little bit eerily familiar. We predicted that the internet would change how children were brought up, how people would find each other as friends, as colleagues, as life partners, as employees, occasionally as the targets of one another's legal action. We predicted that it would change how individual households would relate to the rest of the world. We said that the internet would probably do this by becoming a kind of social presence for the digital age, as opposed to just remaining an information collecting tool. We predicted that human relationships would become subordinate to, or at least dependent on, technological ones. That the act of voting would change forever, and so would most of the things leading up to it. That war, terrorism, and espionage would never be the same again, and neither would medicine or law, education, or shopping. That the basic nature of work itself was going to literally transform, and that it would no longer be anchored in time or to place. Let me just say Mumbai. Some people thought that this would actually be a very good thing, to divorce work from time and place. Others said, I think maybe not so much, because if we do that, doesn't it mean that the concept of ever really being off the clock goes out the window? Well, we won't go there either. We noted that privacy, as we'd known it for some time, was probably just going to sort of evaporate. And neither last nor least, that our very image of ourselves as a species, as human beings, was likely to first twitch a little bit, and then maybe tweak a little bit, and then possibly even transform as our biological selves began to react to the needs of the technologies we might soon come to depend on. In other words, it's a little over-enthusiastic. In other words, that we might begin to co-evolve with our machines. So all that was in the mid-1990s. But here's the real kicker, and it's what brings me to my second story today. In preparation for this talk, I spent a little bit of time exploring what trends as the most pressing technology and society issues today in the spring of 2015. And what I found is that about 90% of the same topics that we were interested in pursuing in 1995 are still hot topics today. They're bigger topics, they're juicier topics, because now we've got Twitter and Facebook and Snapchat and Vine and everything else. There's something new every single day. But fundamentally, we're still looking at the usual suspects. Changes in culture, societal shifts, privacy issues, free speech concerns, citizen rights in tension with national security. We do know more now than we did then, but we don't know everything we need to know, not by a long shot. And sometimes I wonder if because it might be that when you're looking at a moving target, like the internet or related technologies, the old saying really might be true, that the more things change, the more they stay the same. Okay, fast forward from 1995 to 2012. I'm about to go on sabbatical leave for my job at George Washington University. I'm taking a year away from teaching in order to finish up the 3 books that I've somehow gotten behind in writing, and how I got 3 books behind instead of the usual 1 book behind. That's a topic for the cocktail party, not for my time up here at the mic. But at any event, there I am down in my basement, yet another basement, happily dismembering my computer because I'm leaving the country the very next day. When for some reason, some inexplicable reason, I stopped to check my email one more time. Not a good idea. Except, there on my email this time around was another message from someone I'd never met, but who represented an organization that I did know, because it had huge cachet in publishing circles, both inside and outside of the academy. Sage Publications was asking me if I'd be willing to edit what would turn out to be the first of its kind encyclopedia of social media and politics. And I have to confess that at first I thought this was a crank email. I thought that for a number of reasons, mostly because if you hear how I talk about social media in my off hours, it's really X-rated. But also because by training I'm a media anthropologist. I'm not a political scientist. And and I thought they'd want a political scientist. But they said, no, we know you're a media anthropologist, and we wanted to see if you would do this. And of course I got all flattered. Oh, it's me, they want me, that's good, they want me. And then I thought, what am I thinking? An encyclopedia, I can't edit an encyclopedia. I don't have the time, I don't have the energy, I don't have the minions, and I certainly don't have the nervous system it would take to do something like this. So I very politely said no. But the people at Sage were just so nice. They were so nice, and they were so persistent. And so that conversation, which I thought was going to end in the basement, that conversation actually did continue when I got up and I flew out the next day and I left the country. The conversation continued from airports and from the back of taxi cabs and from Starbucks and from pretty much any place I could get a signal as I literally crossed the width of North America. And as that conversation continued to unfold, I realized something. I realized that this was actually the second half of the job that we'd started in 1995, particularly from the policy-making perspective. That job that we started in 1995 down in the basement of the St. James did have an impact on what people then pursued, not as big of an impact as I would have liked, but on what people at all, but what people did pursue in terms of policy design, at least some of the initial interrogatory questions about it. But in 1995, no one, not even a bunch of hyper-caffeinated academics on a 3-day sugar rush could have predicted that the internet was going to morph into the World Wide Web and then breed with the cellular phone and spawn that whole clutch of the technologies that we call personal communications today. But it did. And as a result, convergence had become the byword for an entire generation of scholars as well as innovators in a world where the computer was the dominant gene. And so here was a major player in reference publishing, Sage Communications, Sage Publishing, not just willing but actually eager to take this on, to look at questions that had been important in 1995, had become crucial by 2012, which is when we actually started putting the encyclopedia together, and which remain, as we've seen, not just critical but actually central to concerns today, to public concerns today. And they were inviting me to be part of this. And I have to say that that Sage was visionary. They were absolutely visionary, not because they were inviting me to be part of this, but because of how they thought about politics in general and research in particular, social science research in particular. They had such a visionary and such an elastic version of both of these guiding concepts that they didn't just encourage us to include in the encyclopedia topics that were kind of at the periphery of public vision in 2012, but would move into center stage by the time we got to 2014, when we actually published. They didn't just tolerate that, they actually encouraged it. And we actually debuted a number of ideas in that encyclopedia that have since moved from that periphery into the headlines on a weekly, if not a daily basis. I'll just say a couple, give you a few really quick examples of that. One of them we've already heard about today a little bit, which is revenge pornography. In 2012, not many people knew what revenge pornography actually was, but we kind of had a thought it was important in its own right, and it was going to get to be more important because it's an absolutely vicious way to blow a political career to ribbons, as well as to destroy the private lives of ordinary people who just get caught in a really vengeful situation. So we said to Sage, we'd like to include that, and they said, well, instead of saying, do you have to, they actually said, go right ahead. In fact, please do. So we did include it, and then just last week, I saw in a newspaper article that at least 17 states have now enacted law against revenge pornography, which is, I think that's real progress in the real world. I can't say how much our encyclopedia entry helped sort of raise the public water table in terms of awareness of this problem, but it certainly didn't hurt. And it was a wonderful thing to be able to do. We did have lots of, I'm going to condense a few things. We did have lots of articles on, and entries on, we had both articles and entries on things like drones and cyber surveillance and stuff like that. And that is in the paper and in the headlines and horribly, probably in your office on a regular basis. But one of the things that I do want to pop out that we wrote about was artificial intelligence. And what we wrote about artificial intelligence really felt a little bit like the other part of my life. It felt more like a surrealist play than something that would have been appropriate fodder for an encyclopedia back in 2012. But then, just a year ago this month, we got trumped on that topic. We got trumped by an unusual organization to do that kind of trumping. It was the United Nations. A year ago this month, the United Nations convened probably, I think it is the first ever official investigation of something called lethal autonomous weapon systems. I don't know if anybody in here works with those, but basically it's developing a robotic military, completely self-deciding, sentient, self-mobile robotic infantry. It's kind of like taking Data from Star Trek and giving him an AK-47 and turning him loose in a combat zone. This is an important topic, and it's actually not something on the drawing boards. We're actually building them. We've let contracts for that. So this was an important thing to bring up, even though it seemed a little bit out there. And it is a thing that is now not just out there, but again, in the center. People, forgive me, please, people don't usually talk about Capitol Hill as a cheery place, but when we compare it to robotic infantry, it absolutely is. And my last story, really, has to do with Capitol Hill. And again, this is an example of Sage's visionary approach to social science research, not just in addition to the hard sciences, but also almost where you find it. We wanted to include information in the encyclopedia about how people on Capitol Hill used social media and what they used it for. And because the field in which we were working was so new, there wasn't any information on this. So we said to Sage, you know, if we're going to include this, we have to go get it ourselves. And it's very, very unusual for an encyclopedia to do its own original research. But again, this was a great moment for Sage to say, oh, Carrick, do you have to? And instead they said, no, go for it. And they actually even paid for it. They underwrote it. So we went out and we surveyed both the Senate and the House of Representatives. And we asked those folks how they used social media, how much they used social media, and the relative degrees to which they either enjoyed that or regretted it. And this is probably a place where I should note that my own personal favorite entry in the encyclopedia is a little tiny one that describes a new product offered by Lloyd's of London. They're the folks who insure satellites. Lloyd's of London now offers social media insurance, which it's intended to at least deal with the fiscal damage if you say or do something really unfortunate, on Twitter or Reddit or, God forbid, YouTube. It is not at the moment available for politicians. It's only for corporate leaders. I'm sure they're going to expand their customer base soon. And when they do that, I actually really hope they include academics as well. So that's what I mean when I said to Sage that Sage was visionary, and when I warned them on the phone on that fateful night down in my basement that if I did the encyclopedia, they should know that, well, Lady Gaga was going to be in the encyclopedia, because when she partnered with Harvard University to create the Born This Way Foundation against youth bullying, that was at its core a political act. And again, Sage said, the more the better. By all means, include that and anybody else you can in a similar vein. So we've got stuff with Matt Damon's Water.org, Emma Thompson's work against human slavery, things along those lines. And that's because Sage saw that politics doesn't just happen in the voting booth or on the campaign trail or in the White House or even here on Capitol Hill. Sage saw that politics happens everywhere people happen. They saw that politics happens in the workplace, in the kitchen, at school, on the metro, in places of worship, at the police station, and that politics absolutely happens in the bedroom. Sage saw that politics happens wherever living takes place, which means that politics are everywhere. And that's where social science research needs to happen too. All of those places and many, many more, because social science research is what gives context and momentum to research we get from the hard sciences. What we call STEM research, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, it's crucial, yeah, it's necessary, but it is not sufficient. It is not sufficient if the real goal is to create a world in which science and technology and the politics they both provoke and reflect are going to actually make sense for all of us. Yes, research in the hard sciences absolutely can bring us to new levels of ingenuity, new peaks of performance, new methods for interacting with the world and everything that's in it. And yes, it can make us, it's one of the things we do need to make us more competitive in the global economic landscape. But it takes the social sciences to make sense of those new gifts, those new techniques, those new opportunities that the hard sciences are so good at delivering. So here's my final story for today. A headline in the New York Times caught my eye last month. But actually, it didn't, if I'm honest, it didn't catch my eye. It took my breath away. It was a cover page story of a recent breakthrough in something called genome editing, which is, which is when they manipulate human DNA in one person in a way that will persist intergenerationally. So for instance, they might tinker with one of my bits of DNA, and then my offspring would exhibit the tinkered trait, not the one that I would have handed down to them had an intervention not occurred. Whoa, this is big stuff. This is a remarkable thing. But even more remarkable is the reason that story was in the New York Times. The very scientists who perfected this technique were asking that it not be used until it had been debated, discussed, probed, and explored by people who were not scientists, as well as by people who are. In other words, they were bold enough, forward-thinking enough, brave enough to state very publicly that science may not always be capable of making decisions by itself about the kinds of things that science and technology can now deliver. So hard scientists themselves were actually calling for collaboration from the full range of human expertise to help navigate an alluring but a really complicated future. So Albert Einstein, who was, of course, the iconic hard scientist, had this to say about the nature of knowledge and its potential for improving the human world. Einstein said, "Life is change. Growth is optional. Choose wisely." So today we're here to celebrate the fact that for 50 years, SAGE has been providing publications that help us to choose wisely. And at the heart of that is material from the social sciences. It will take more than coffee and donuts in the future to achieve the kind of reflective deep dive that Albert Einstein is urging us to do. It'll take the kinds of things that only social science can deliver and that SAGE excels at publishing. And I actually have to confess, I'm now going to scrap my really nice, neat little ending that I'd worked up and have been practicing in secret all day today. And that ending was very symmetrical. It said, oh, yeah, the social sciences are crucial. We can do it. We can do that deep dive. We only have to remember what we already know, build on each other, all of which is true. Be curious, not defensive or dismissive about the things that we don't know, and that it might be, in this time and place in our collective intellectual journey, that that old saying has to have its valences switched, that the more things seem to stay the same, the more they actually do change. And I want to add something to that, based on what I've heard from my fellow panelists today. In a way, I'm just really tired of social science having to say we're as good as the hard sciences. If there's nothing else to take away from that story in the New York Times, from the kinds of work that we've heard about today, from Sage's remarkable 50 years of publication in the social sciences, what we can take away is this. We are not children of a lesser data set. We are actually the translators between the tidal wave of funding and brain power and media attention and expertise that go into the hard sciences right now and the rest of the world. We are not just the translators. Everybody who's ever translated everything also knows when you translate something, you create it. And if there was ever a time for the social sciences to not just hustle and nudge and try to get for equal footing with the hard sciences, but actually say, pride, to borrow from other social movements, pride, this is the time. So thank you so much for listening to my story, and thank you so much to Sage.
There was a moment a couple of years ago when political science funding by the National Science Foundation was under threat, and I had a call with a staffer of a member of Congress who's on the House Science Committee, and I said, well, what can we do? What do you need? Do you need like a grand vision of what political science is? And he said, no, not really. What we really need is just some good stories. And I said, really? Yeah, just some good stories. Just something about that, that's all we need to sort of be able to make the case. Well, of course, you need a lot more than that, but that would have been a good starting point. And I just thought of that again today as we heard all of the stories of the members of this panel. So please join me again in thanking them for their stories. We're going to wrap up, but I know that all of them would be happy to stay and to answer questions if you want to talk to any of them individually or collectively. And before we depart, let's take another moment, and actually I think we should stand and applaud and thank the work of Sage and all of the advocacy and the publishing they've done. Thank you.